Well, good day. Welcome to a discussion of Aesop's Tales and the history of the foundation of the Esop Centre. We're delighted today to have Malcolm Hurlston, our founder and life president. Malcolm is the epitome of a social entrepreneur. Educated at Cambridge, he trained as a Russian interrogator during national service. He then worked as a journalist, television trainer, and lobbyist. Hurlston conceived the Trades Union Bank Unity back in 1980, founded the Registry Trust in 1985, and founded the Employee Share Ownership Centre in 1987 to bring leveraged employee share ownership to Europe. And that is the subject of today's webinar. Today, he shares with us his journey. Malcolm.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's very kind of you to allow me to have the starring role today. And I am confident that none of the organizations you've mentioned would have started without me. But starting is one thing and success is entirely another. And for success, you have to look around at all the people who you really need to make the thing work for the long term. That's always a team job. And in my particular case, I think always you need people with resources, always you need people with ideas, always you need people with loyalty. And you have to put the total package together, or it has to find you to make something not just a good start, but a great success. And I would have all those people in mind at the same time as I pursue this narrative. The first time I had the word Esop mentioned to me was in a phone call. I had started the Trade Union Bank because I'd been asked to find a way of stopping the British trade unions, as they then were, from being taken away from the cooperative bank by trade union banks, which had started in Germany and Israel. And so I suggested to the chief of the bank, if they really want a bank, why not give them one? And he, Lewis Lee, said, fine, you go ahead. So he gave me a carte blanche, really, to go ahead. And I worked with a guy called Fred Jarvis of GMB, always one of the major unions. But Fred's key role otherwise was running an organization called Trade Unions for Labour Victory. And the key thing about that was it consisted of the treasurers of all the major unions. So they were the people who knew where the money was, where money would come from, what could be done in practice. And it took Fred and myself, in the end, about nearly 3 years to set up the bank, which we launched on, very appropriately, on May Day, 1984. And for our first managing director, at my suggestion, Lewis Lee appointed Terry Thomas, not the Terry Thomas of comedy fame, but the man who is to become Lord Thomas of Macclesfield. And there we were with a financial institution. It couldn't at that stage be a bank. There we were with a financial institution, but with no money to lend. So in order to get over those difficult initial times, when we wanted to exist, we wanted to become well known, we also had to find something to do, something to grab people's attention and to make them feel we were doing a worthwhile job. And that's when there was a kind of great stroke of luck. I saw a story in the Financial Times written by a good friend, Bill Hall. And in that story, he wrote about how 4 unions at Frontier, which was an airline in Colorado, how 4 unions were going to buy the airline. So Bill gave me the contact number of Lorraine Laughlin. And Lorraine Laughlin was from the Association of Flight Attendants. And I said to Lorraine, well, this is an absolutely amazing idea that unions could be thinking of buying an airline. How on earth do you do it? And Lorraine said to me, my American accent isn't perfect. Lorraine said to me, we're using our ESOPs. So after the first time I heard the word ESOP, and from then on, I began to look at the ESOP and the role it was then playing in the United States. And I said to Terry Thomas at the bank, Terry, I think we ought to go to America and have a study visit. Terry agreed. And so we set up a visit, which started in California, where we visited a couple of companies with ESOPs. Then we went to Colorado to see Lorraine and to understand what was happening on the ground. And finally, we ended our visit to the United States in Florida, where, as it happened, the leader of the TG, of GMB, David Bassett, was in an international union meeting. Terry and I had been very impressed by what we'd seen about ESOPs. David was equally enthusiastic for another reason also, because just recently, the chief executive of a big UK company, Roadchef, had told David, who organized the company, how much he wanted to be able to give the company to his employees. So David saw immediately the practical application of the ESOP in the United Kingdom, as well as the theoretical value of the unions having something to take out of Unity before the deposits had been gathered to create a proper bank which could do lending as well. Roadchef, of course, is another story, but those of you who read our newspad will see it well followed there. From then onwards, it was a question of how to take it to the next stage. Now, I think the inspiration for the next stage came by looking at what had been actually happening in the United States. There are two people I particularly want to bring to the fore here. First of all, there's Lewis Kelso, whose name will always be associated with the idea that people in the workforce deserve to have not only the wages of labour, but also in additional, and that in addition is very important, in addition, they ought to have the wages of capital, which gave them an additional upside. And his ideas were also inspired, as were ours really, by the governor of Louisiana, Huey Long, known as the Kingfisher. And he, in the time of the Great Depression, which perhaps in financial terms was the closest to the kind of depression we're looking at today, he had a program which he called Share Our Wealth. He wanted to share wealth to the extent, pretty much the extent, that our current Chancellor is doing today. And high on the agenda of sharing your wealth was spreading employee ownership. Huey had the slogan, every man a king, but no one wears a crown. Unfortunately, Huey himself was assassinated before he had a chance to challenge for the leadership of the Democrats. But he was able to put what he believed into practice in Louisiana. And after his death, it was his son, Russell Long, who brought forward in Congress nearly all the federal legislation which has created the American ESOP. The American ESOP as we saw it then, and the American ESOP as it exists today. So Russell Long was the big player and the big link It also pointed out the difference between the United Kingdom and the United States, because what was happening in the United States was built on many successive years of legislation, whereas in the United Kingdom, we had a blank sheet. Now, we should have gone down the route of seeking to get legislation, but that could have taken 10, 20, well, maybe 40 years. I took the alternative. I went to David Reed of Clifford Turner, the law firm, and David, I think if he'd been Gil Benkin, he's the man to him, everybody pays his 2.5%. Because David came up with the idea of how one could create the effect of the American ESOP in the United Kingdom with what we called the twin trust system, which was about bringing together the profit sharing trust with an employee benefit trust, one located in the United Kingdom, the other located ideally offshore. So the twin trust system was what enabled us to say, we have brought the ESOP to Britain and it is getting going now. Of course, it was entirely different from the American ESOP. Its effects were the same, the legislative background was different. And that remains exactly the same today. There has been no bringing together. The American ESOP is effectively a kind of retirement plan, whereas our own ESOP is very much additional to pensions as was then conceived. Fascinating times. But David Reed was able to do this because he was also extremely close to the senior partner, Sir Max Williams, who was in charge of the Law Society also at the time. And together they'd taken steps towards forming a multidisciplinary partnership, which was called the Bridge Street Consultants, under a man called Laurie Brennan, who was a fantastic disruptor and a great stylist. Laurie and I had some common interest. He had been a Christian brother, that was not a common interest. But after that, he had worked on what I'll call the other side of the Foreign Office in Moscow. And of course, that resonated with my own experience of dealing with the Soviet Union. We obviously had quite a number of interests in common. David Reed had, with Max, had created that first multidisciplinary partnership, and it had been extremely challenging. And I'd been given the role of letting it be known that it existed without publicizing it too much. I think that our idea at the start would have been not to form the Esop Centre, but to say, look, Clifford Turner and Unity have got a good thing going here, let's exploit it. But it didn't take long for it to be clear that the whole Esop concept ought to be bigger than both of us. And so Unity and Clifford Turner asked me if I would help them to form the Esop Centre. And that was in 1986, a couple of years after Unity itself had been formed. And we started obviously with Unity and with Clifford Turner and with New Bridge Street, and mainly a number of American banks who were interested from their lending experience in the United States, but also because they saw significant kind of hedging opportunities in the whole ESOP world, which people still do, but I think probably more thinking about it has ever taken place than practical activity. So in 1986, therefore, we were able to start the centre, and a year or two later, the second big law firm in the United Kingdom at the time, Linklaters, came on board too. And at that stage, we had a opening up really towards everybody else in the United Kingdom who might be interested in what we were trying to do. We had at the same time our close relations with our colleagues in the United States. I followed very much Corey Rosen, who, as Americans nearly always are, was extremely generous with his time and support. He had started the National Centre for Employee Ownership with a focus very much on, sort of slightly leftist focus on employee ownership. He had started it and originally in Massachusetts, and then later he carried it on from California, where he is today. The Association for Companies and the bigger players was called the Esop Association and was run by a remarkable man, certainly for the Americans you meet in everyday life, David Binns, who was fluent in French. And it took only 2 or 3 years for David and myself to say, isn't it time we took employee ownership to Europe as well? So we gave a joint seminar in Paris where David and I both presented fluently in French. He a bit better than me. And that went swimmingly. It was only when people started asking the questions, which we couldn't understand as well or reply to, that the whole thing began to fall apart. Still, we'd planted the flag, and even today, England and the United Kingdom and France are the only 2 countries in Europe where the level of employee share ownership is significant. The slow growth otherwise among countries outside France in the European Union is a result of the difficulties the European Union has always had in moving such things forward. We worked well with the European Union on many occasions, but their problem was always that they would ask member states for the answers. Member states sent back to them those of apples and pears, which they tried to put together, not some university to try and coalesce, but there was never kind of real figures there. Whereas in the real world, with the multinational companies who flocked to us, the multinational companies, whatever country they're in with Europe, were giving shares, offering shares to their employees. But that was the hidden picture.
Malcolm.
That takes us along the way, Michael. Would you like to pose any questions at this stage?
Yes, just a couple, Malcolm. I think it's absolutely fascinating, this. I don't think people realize the depth of thinking that went on, particularly during the Great Depression. And I'm sort of curious, we've got a couple of questions up here and not a lot of time, but somebody's asking something similar. What do you think we have to learn from the 1930s today?
I think we have to learn from the 1930s. I think in particular, we've got to put money into people's hands. We need everybody to be aspirational, have a decent lifestyle, be dealt with well, and to have hope above the bare necessities. And this is really what Huey Long was aiming to do, and Roosevelt was nervous about.
And just looking back over what is clearly an amazing nearly 4 decades that you've been deeply involved in this, what would you point to as perhaps the biggest success of the Esop Centre?
What was the major success? I think it was really being able to carry it forward over this period, and certainly to carry forward with all the political parties. It's not yet ideal, but every political party in the United Kingdom is supportive of what we're trying to do. It's a feature of our system that we have to spin them a slightly different tale to meet the policies that they put down. And that's something else where we can learn from the United States, where the political parties work together a great deal better on matters like this than they do here. But one way or another, we've been fortunate on that. First of all, we had terrific support from Margaret Thatcher, and she in fact used some legislation brought in the last year, the Callaghan government, following the Lib Lab Pact. Our next great supporter was Gordon Brown, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, who brought in probably the most generous relief ever given, EMI. And then finally, during the time of the coalition, the Employee Ownership Trust was created at a time when Sir Norman Lamb, with the Liberal Democrats as Minister of State. So I think that is there's the most important points.
Well, that's certainly something to be inordinately proud of, and I can totally vouch for your ability to deal with the Conservative, Labour and Lib Dems and the high regard in which you're held by all of them. Just a final, almost flippant question, but you trained as you were a television trainer in the early days. How do you find being on a webinar?
Well, it's quite an interesting experience. So, what do they say? Those who can do, those who can't teach.
Well, Malcolm, this has been an exciting introduction. I just wanted to close on a couple of points, if I may. Just wanted a word about some of the resources that are available still these days. We have a constant web stream of information on all sorts of subjects, but I'd point to two. One is, for many years, the Esop Centre's newspad, which Fred Hackworth has been pulling together with enormous assistance from you, has provided fantastic coverage, and this is just a copy of this month's edition on the screen. We also have a number of resources in the form of bulletins, which we are able to provide to members. They cover a number of things, but I would point to two. One is obviously employee share ownership itself, but the second one is the idea that this is part of a much wider agenda that falls under Sustainable Development Goal 10. That's the UN Sustainable Development Goal to reduce inequality. And I think one of the things that I always remember Huey Long being famous for was his idea that inequality, the ratio of wealth amongst mankind should be no greater than 300 to 1, which sounds absurd at first glance, and yet, of course, we're nowhere close to achieving that. So Huey Long is a long way from achieving SDG 10. Anyway, folks, it's been fantastic to have Malcolm share with us the origins of the Esop Centre, and I would just like to conclude by saying thank you for your time. Thank you, Malcolm, for showing us what the origins were like, and we look forward to a number of other webinars on many related topics in the weeks and months to come. Thank you very much.